There are two things I want to do before I start my presentation. One was disagree with you completely. You committed the other journalistic error of saying journalists like to think there's always two sides to every story, but the great thing about science is one side is usually wrong. And the other was that you said religion and science are rivals, but that's like saying Bambi and Godzilla are rivals. Anyway, but before I go on, I want to actually thank the organizers of this, and thank all of you for coming. I'm overwhelmed that all of you wanted to hear this. But also, the City Bible Forum has been incredibly gracious to me, putting up with a lot of cantankerous behavior in advance and treating me with great respect, and I appreciate it, and which is one of the reasons why I agreed to do these events. And I want to thank Peter and Glenn and all the others here, and Emma, I guess, and everyone else who's been involved, because they're wonderful. I'd really like to give them a round of applause because they've done a great job. And they're also very brave, and I want to thank that. They knew that I was in Australia on Sunday, and I had to go to the United States on Sunday for a meeting on Monday and come back on Monday, and got here today at 2. And the likelihood that that would all work out and that I would be awake was minimal. But it has put me in a bad mood, which is useful. Okay, so let me now begin with my official presentation. So I come here not to bury God, but to praise honesty, full disclosure, and skeptical empirical inquiry, which, alas, are burying God. But that's the key thing I want to talk about. And so since I believe in full disclosure, I thought I'd give some full disclosure, which is my biases. What really matters to me is the ethics of science, open questioning, the fact that there are no scientific authorities, that we believe in honesty, transparency, reliance on evidence, peer review, and testability. All of these, I believe, make the world a better place. And they do so specifically by burying myth and superstition and dogma. Honesty and transparency are incredibly important. And what I'm going to do tonight is difficult for me. And I should have checked my time now to make sure I go about the right amount of time. I have great respect for rational and honest discussion, and no respect for distortion and misrepresentation. Dr. Craig is a fine gentleman, I'm sure, and a wonderful husband, father, etc., but probably so was George Bush. But that didn't change the fact that I detested the lies and distortion associated with his administration, and I detest the lies and distortion that have been associated with William Lane Craig, and I can't hide that. Now, we have limited time here, and I'm hoping most of the information content will come from the discussion and questions. So I can't, obviously, in 15 minutes give a comprehensive overview of science and religion, much less history, which I wouldn't attempt to do. But the real purpose of this that I want to do is raise questions, encourage discussion, motivate your skeptical thinking, and motivate you to open inquiry. And the rest is just extra. Okay, so let's begin. The title of this thing, as you just pointed out, has one problem, but it has two problems. Has science buried God suggests that there's one God. Like the God that the people who organize this thing and William believe in is somehow special. But that's not true. There are lots of gods, and science has buried all of them. Human civilization began by putting purpose and intelligent purpose behind gods associated with the sun, the moon, the planets, the wind, the earth, the oceans. It's been, by one estimate, over 1,000 different gods throughout human history. Mars, god of war, Poseidon, Thor, all the rest. And the really important thing is that all of you, or almost all of you probably, are now atheists regarding those gods. Just the only difference is it's just one that we may disagree about. But 999, we all agree, have been thrown out. And the reason they've been thrown out is they've been buried by the rise of our physical understanding. Science works. And the fact that science works has buried the gods of the wind and the sun and the moon. Farmers now, as I was just saying, when it doesn't rain, they don't pray for rain anymore. They go see a meteorologist. And that's a good thing. In the process, the human condition has improved immensely, and it will continue to improve as science continues to bury the one remaining God. Now, this one God is supposedly left. We might ask a priori or in advance, how likely is it in advance that all those other 999 gods were false, but this one's true? Well, you might argue if you had a flat tire that it's probably pretty small likelihood. But it doesn't really matter. The point is that our current understanding of nature has changed. We've learned things. It's changed and developed since the claims were made by Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. And therefore, it's natural that science is inconsistent with those claims based on ignorance. And we shouldn't revere those ancient claims as sacred. They're ignorant. There's still many open questions. I'll try my 10 seconds of humility. It'll be the only time tonight. There's a lot we don't know about the universe, a lot more we don't know than we do. That's the wonder of science. That's why I'm a scientist. But it is intellectually lazy to just stop asking questions and stop looking for physical explanations and just say God did it. That's lazy. And the other thing that's important in this extra God is there's nothing special about Jesus that's any different than the other gods, or any other fictional heroes for that matter. First of all, there's no empirical evidence that he was divine. None, not one iota. In that sense, he shares it with every other god that's ever been proposed. The myths associated with Jesus are associated with all the other myths, and the Bible. The flood myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written well before the Bible, exactly the same. The hero of the Bible was asked to create an ark and put all the species 2 by 2 on 7 levels. Same thing. Virgin birth, nothing special about Jesus. Oh, look at all these. They're all supposed to have been born of virgins. The whole story, in fact, take Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, versus Jesus. It's exactly the same. They were both born from a virgin mother. They were fathered by the King of Heaven. They were turned from the dead. They transformed water into wine. In fact, they, talked about eating and drinking the flesh and blood of the Creator. They were taken as a liberator of mankind. That story has been told over and over again, and this is just one of the most recent renderings. Nothing special. And the resurrection is nothing special. The myth of resurrection has been around since Osiris. Osiris was one of the major Egyptian gods, and it used to be just the kings in Egypt would be resurrected when Osiris was resurrected. But eventually, in the New Kingdom, anyone could be resurrected with Osiris. I was going to say with Jesus, but it doesn't matter. If they follow the correct religious rituals, the same nonsense. Now, the point is that the fact that these beliefs are in fact being destroyed is related to the fact that the belief depends upon not just time, not just history, and the fact is, frankly, that in the Western world at least, the number of people who have a religious affiliation is monotonically going down. But it depends on where you live. If you're born in the U.S., and you're religious, you believe in the Bible and Jesus. If you're born in India and you're religious, you might believe in Brahman and who's manifest through Gensha. If you're from the Islamic world, you think the Quran is the perfect word of God and Muhammad is the latest prophet. It's kind of interesting that your belief depends on where you're from. But what's great is we live in a world where information is becoming more freely available. And because of that global access to information, we are seeing religion go down. Because people are learning that the myths and lies that they've been taught, when they learn about the rest of the world, that other people believe other myths and lies that are inconsistent with their myths and lies. And that's why we're seeing religion dying more and more. Now, the point is, and Stephen Pinker, it's a quote I like, that just said, the acquisition of knowledge is hard. Our minds are prone to illusions, fallacies, and superstitions. That's the point. It was put more succinctly by Fox Mulder on the X-Files, who said, I want to believe. And the point is, we all want to believe. That's what we have to remember. And as scientists, we have to remember that we want to believe, and we have to work hard to overcome that desire to believe. Science, we work with skepticism, open debate, honesty, transparency, knowledge, the fact that we know that we have uncertainty, and we know coincidences happen, and we require formal precision and empirical tests. The residual beliefs in religion are due, in fact, large part to the discrepancy between the laws of probability and the workings of cognition. Most people think when an accident happens to them, it means something. We're all conditioned to believe that, and we'll talk about that more later if you want in terms of miracles. Now, I don't have enough time to do adequate justice to science, but science has continued. The evolution of science, getting rid of the gods of the sun, the moon, the wind, fire, the oceans, etc., has continued to push God away. Newton, who was a religious man, spent more time writing about God than physics, in fact. Also, however, got rid of angels pushing planets around the sun because he didn't need them. They were gone. Darwin, once he recognized natural selection and evolution, got rid of the notion of special creation for each species. You didn't need God and miracles anymore to create each species. The divine spark that caused life in the first place is not so divine. Everything we now know about biochemistry and the discovery of complex amino acids in space tells us that it's quite likely that the complex organic molecules on which life is based either arose in space or developed on Earth. We don't know the origin of life, as I'll talk about, but it's certainly plausible now that you don't need a divine spark. We don't need God to say, let there be an Earth or a moon or sun or anything. We can show from the laws of physics how all matter is created. And when it comes to the origin of the universe, we are coming remarkably close to the realization that you don't need any miracle for that either. And that's because our knowledge of the universe is changing, not because we want to get rid of God, but because the more we learn, the less we need anything outside of the laws of physics and chemistry and biology. But it's good because science does more than that. It doesn't just tell us about the world, it makes the world a better place. It gets rid of the vile, awful, immoral works like the Bible. The worldview that I would argue guides most of you in this room today, including those of you people of faith, which I assume is some fraction of the people in this audience. Those spiritual values of any educated person today are largely the worldview given us by science. Your worldview is vastly different than it would have been 4 centuries ago. By stripping ecclesiastical authority of its credibility on factual matters, which we've certainly done, we cast doubt on its claims to certainty in matters of morality, which is great, because we now think that women are equal to men, that we don't hate gays, all of the stupid myths that are permeated by various religions. The facts of science, moreover, force us to take responsibility for the welfare of ourselves, our species, and our planet. And that is what we need to do in the 21st century. Now, Dr. Craig is an apologist, and there's good reason to apologize. One of the first apologists in the year 208 wrote, this is great, "The Son of God died just because it is absurd, it is to be believed. And he was buried and rose again. It is certain because it is impossible." That's the rationality of an apologist. Apologists often conjure up a veneer of rational justification and evidential support for their God by distorting and misrepresenting results of science and logic, something Dr. Craig does exceptionally well. In doing so, they do a disservice to everyone, including people of faith, which is why I came here, because the people of honest faith should recognize when things are being distorted. St. Augustine once said, if you want to go out and convince the heathen of your God, you better show that you're not lying about the real world. We need to bury God for a bunch of reasons. This is the God we need to bury. In Deuteronomy, he said, kill all men and women. He told the Israelites, kill all the men and women in a conquered city, and seize the women, children, and livestock as plunder. But in the cities of these people, you should kill absolutely everybody. Now, we live in a world where you can't preach, in the modern world, in the non-fundamentalist world, where you can't preach genocide anymore because we buried God. You can't, and if someone drowns their children in a bathtub because they say God is talking to them, we put them in a mental institution. Now, Dr. Craig loves children. But to go to the lengths of enforcing belief, this is what he says, to justify this. Why take the lives of innocent children? If we believe, as I do, that God's grace is extended to those who die in infancy or as small children, the death of these children was actually their salvation. Therefore, God does these children no wrong in taking their lives. It gets worse. He went on and said, who does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites? Not the Canaanite adults, for they were corrupt and deserving of judgment. They deserve to die. Not the kids, because they inherit eternal life. Who are the really people that we should suffer for? The poor soldiers who had to kill them. If that isn't obscene enough, Dr. Craig then, a third time, went back and thought about this and said, you know what, I've come to appreciate as a result of a closer reading of the biblical text that God's command to Israel was not primarily to exterminate the Canaanites, but to drive them out of the land. If they just left, no one had been killed at all. Only those who remained were to be utterly exterminated. Oh, that's great. That obscenity is the reason that my friend and colleague Richard Dawkins will not appear on stage with this man. Now, the key thing that I want to emphasize, that will go on in the discussion that's going to happen, because I've been in a debate with Dr. Craig, is a misrepresentation about use of science to justify belief. Now, some apologists are better than others. Here's one who's kind of not so good at it.
You know, one of the age-old questions of science is what keeps the nucleus together. Remember, the nucleus consists of a bundle of protons and neutrons. Now, protons have a positive charge. What do positive charges do? They repel each other. So you've got these protons in the very nucleus of the atom, and atoms are the building blocks of the entire universe, and yet at the very center of the atom, you have a multiplicity of protons that ought to repel each other. They ought to be driven apart. There ought to be no way you can keep them together. And scientists have pondered since they first understood the makeup of the atom, what is it that holds the nucleus of the atom together? How does that thing stay together? What holds it together? They've been looking for what scientists call the nuclear glue that keeps them from flying apart. Well, now we know. Now we know what the glue is that holds together the entire universe and keeps it from flying apart. It is Jesus Christ. In him.
Okay, I think I can stop him there. Okay, you got the subtle problem. Now, the point is, if you don't know anything about nuclear physics, you might even say that's a big mystery that scientists don't know anything about. But we understand exactly what holds a neutron and proton together, the strong force that a Nobel Prize was given for it, calculations can be done. But if your audience is scientifically ignorant, you can make it appear as if you're scientific. Now, Dr. Craig is much more refined and intelligent than that man, I can say, having spent time with him. But that doesn't mean he doesn't use the same techniques. When you can't check his facts, or he doesn't think you know them, he will lie. And here's an example that comes close to home. There's a movie that just came out about Richard Dawkins and me called The Unbelievers. I was amazed to discover Dr. Craig did not one, not two, but 3 podcasts on the movie and wrote a review. The movie hasn't been distributed yet. So I was amazed that he'd seen it. When at first I thought, well, maybe he stole the movie and then he was a thief. Or maybe he just lied about seeing the movie, in which case he's a liar. Maybe he's a thief and a liar. Well, the remarkable thing is you can't see the movie, so you can't see what's wrong. But let me play these 2 clips.
For example, there's a very, I think, uncharitable exchange between Dawkins and Cardinal Pell concerning evolutionary theory, where Dawkins clearly tries to set Pell up to embarrass him. He says to him, "Do you believe that human beings are evolved from apes?" And Pell answers, "Probably so." And then Dawkins says, "Do you believe then that human beings are evolved from Neanderthals?" And Pell says, "Probably so." And then Dawkins springs the trap. Well, that shows you don't understand evolutionary theory, because Neanderthals are not ancestors of human beings, of Homo sapiens. They are our cousins, not our ancestors, attempting to show Pell's ignorance of evolutionary theory. So this was clearly an attempt by Dawkins to simply set up and embarrass his opponent in an unfair way.
Do you accept that humans evolved from apes?
Yeah, probably. From Neanderthals, yes.
Bill, another point is Krauss's statement about Darwin. Krauss said that Darwin showed the origin of life is not a miracle.
Isn't that a remarkable statement? Darwin showed that the origin of life is not a miracle. Darwin had nothing to say about the origin of life. So this is just a scientific error on Krauss's part in this film.
That there's some similarity. Before Darwin, life was a miracle. You couldn't ask the question, where did the diversity of life come from? It was a miracle. It was design. What Darwin showed were very simple laws of biology. Natural selection and genetic mutation, essentially, could produce all the diversity of life, the complexity we now see, from very simple beginnings, with no miracle. Now, at the time he did it, did he prove it? No. But it was plausible. Now there's been 150 years of proof. Now we take it to the next step. Do we know how the first forms of life started? Absolutely not. But it's certainly plausible that, given everything we know about genetics, biochemistry, that chemistry, by natural processes, can turn into biology. Do we know that? No. But it's plausible, and that's worth celebrating, that you don't need miracles. Okay, now I should wrap up. I was going to show some other clips having to do with, in fact, claims by Dr. Craig about the fact that animals don't suffer, and a beautiful film that's produced online, which you should look at, which showed that in fact his claims were spurious. Then he produced a podcast arguing against them, and then they did a wonderful clip or film that showed in fact that his claims were in fact lies. And in fact, my favorite part is one statement where he says, you know, a scientifically informed philosopher is much better to talk about these neuroscience issues than a philosophically naive neuroscientist. And then, to compound that, he writes to a different audience, this is not an issue of theology, it's only neuroscience. But let me just conclude. I'm not going to show these clips out of deference to the time constraints, even though they're great, and maybe we can have time for them later. But I just want to summarize. Knowledge about the physical world has buried already almost all the gods. There's nothing different about Jesus or Christianity. The process of science overcomes our natural tendencies to believe in myth and superstition and replace dogma with knowledge that works. We need to bury God to produce a better moral and ethical world. We must openly call out lies and distortions, even if it's uncomfortable, as it was, believe me, tonight. We should foster open questioning, refutation by others, and no false claims of certainty. That is incredibly important. Finally, burying God is not a bad thing. It's not a negative thing. Science provides gifts in return. The universal invitation to question anyone's claims and the universal requirement, to exercise due diligence and the duty of care to substantiate those claims. And my main purpose tonight, in fact, the most important purpose in any lecture I give, my chief goal tonight is to encourage the broad use of these gifts, independent of the question we're talking about tonight. Thank you very much.
If you've ever watched a fiery debate about science, religion, or anything of the sort, chances are you've seen Lawrence Krauss in action. A physicist, cosmologist, and relentless advocate for scientific skepticism, Krauss has been one of the most outspoken figures in the atheist movement over the past few decades. And unlike some thinkers who usually approach the subject with cautious diplomacy, Krauss has never been one to mince his words. He is sharp, confrontational, and utterly unafraid to challenge religious dogma head-on. And somehow he manages not to be controversial or insulting in the process. But still, with that in mind, over time his approach has made him a polarizing figure, but also an undeniably influential one in the atheist and belief community, which has shaped the way many people think about the clash between faith and reason. Now, Krauss's journey into the public sphere as an atheist voice wasn't an accident. It grew naturally from his work in physics, particularly his research on the origins of the universe. His best-selling book, A Universe from Nothing, became a lightning rod for debate because it offered a scientific answer to one of religion's most cherished questions: why is there something rather than nothing? In the book, Krauss argued that modern cosmology shows how a universe can and likely did emerge from nothingness without any divine intervention. And needless to say, this idea didn't just rattle religious apologists, it also energized skeptics by providing another concrete, evidence-based alternative to theistic explanations. Also, what makes Krauss stand out in the atheist community is his willingness to engage directly and often aggressively with religious claims. Where some scientists might avoid outright confrontation, Krauss usually leans into it. He is famous for his debates with theologians and apologists, where he dismantles their arguments with a mix of cutting humor and hard evidence, or hard science. And as you may have noticed, ladies and gentlemen, whether he's taking on William Lane Craig's philosophical defenses of God or challenging the idea that morality comes from religion, Krauss doesn't just disagree, he goes on the offensive usually, often pointing out the absurdities and contradictions in religious thinking. Also worth noting, one of his most significant contributions to atheism is his insistence that science doesn't just disagree with religion, it replaces it, as you've seen him argue throughout the video. Unlike some people who usually argue that science and faith can coexist, Krauss maintains that the more we learn about the universe, the less room there is for supernatural explanations. He often points out that gods were once used to explain thunder, diseases, and the movement of the stars, but as science advanced, those gods usually kept retreating into smaller gaps. The God of the gaps argument, basically. So now, with our understanding of quantum mechanics, cosmology, and evolutionary biology, those gaps have basically shrunk to nearly nothing. Which means that for Krauss, clinging to religion in the face of this progress isn't just irrational, it's an obstacle to human knowledge. And I wholeheartedly agree, man. Anyway, that is it for today, man. I really hope that you've enjoyed the video. Please remember to leave a comment below letting me know if you'd like me to cover any specific person that you like. Anyway, in the meantime, stay safe. I'll see you in the next one, man. Peace.